Thank you for joining me for this webinar on inflation for TRIO professionals. We now continue this webinar with part 4, how does inflation impact TRIO students and their families? What's the status of low-income families? And what are the circumstances? According to Moody's Analytics, inflation is costing families an extra $300 a month right now. And I did a little analysis on the average budget of the lowest 20% of households by income. And based on my analysis, just from the increase in cost in food and transportation and housing alone, I do estimate that in the last 2 years, it's now costing families about $235 more per month for just those three things, just for food, housing, and transportation. And according to a recent survey by GoBankingRates.com, 40% of Americans do not have $300 in savings to handle an emergency. And I want to kind of contrast the first line there to the second line, that if 40% of Americans don't have $300 in savings to handle an emergency, how are families expected to handle an extra $300 a month in expenses due to inflation? The math just doesn't add up. You might be able to do it the first month, but you can't the next month. And then 2/3 of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, according to CNBC. I've got two charts in the next slides, both from the Federal Reserve website. They do a survey of families, and they ask about who could cover a $400 emergency expense using cash or its equivalent. And I went ahead and broke it down by education because, as we know, for TRIO programs, our students are typically first generation. And so what we see here is that people who have a bachelor's degree are much more likely to have the emergency money, the $400 in emergency money, whereas folks who just have some or high school, they're much less likely to be able to absorb a $400 emergency expense. And for folks who have less than a high school degree, only 33% of them said that they could cover a $400 emergency expense using cash or their savings. This slide shows a breakdown by race and ethnicity. And I think it was just really interesting that only around 50% of Black and Hispanic adults could cover a $400 emergency expense using cash or its equivalent. And this brings back to mind to me at a FAFSA workshop years ago where I was working with a student and his father and asked his dad how much money was in savings. And it was just a couple $100s. And with inflation the way it is now, these families, the ones who don't have that emergency fund, are suffering much more than those who have emergency funds. This is an average in 2019 of the typical expenses for the lowest 20% of households in the US. And this is based on the Consumer Expenditure Survey by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So as you can see in the left-hand side there, that the average annual income of the lowest 20% of households in the US is only $12,236. And the average annual spending is $16,000 more than what they are bringing in after taxes. Some of that may be attributed to certain benefits, like maybe SNAP benefits or housing vouchers or health insurance benefits as well, like Medicaid or things like that, may account for why they're spending more than what they actually bring in. But the likelihood is that they're also having to take out debt in order to make their purchases as well. On the right-hand side, it shows the monthly cost of these different expenditures and then the overall percentage of their budget as well. And so we see that they're spending 40% on housing, almost 16% on transportation, almost 10% on healthcare, almost 10% on groceries. And that right there is 75% of their budget, leaving a very small amount of money to any kind of discretionary spending. And I don't view personal care or apparel as discretionary spending. I view those as necessities as well. And so there's just very little room for them to absorb increased cost. Here's just a visual representation of what we saw in the last slide of the breakdown. Again, about 75% is consumed by just 4 categories: housing, transportation, healthcare, and food. And I want to note that the Department of Housing and Urban Development defines cost-burdened families as those who pay more than 30% of their income for housing, and that those people who are cost-burdened may have difficulty affording necessities such as food, clothing, transportation, and medical care.
Now, here's maybe a blip of like good news, and that is that wages have increased. This is from the Atlanta Fed, and it's from the current population survey as well. So this chart shows that in the last year, overall wages have increased by 6.1% nationally. Uh, the downside of this, though, is that rising wages also contributes to inflation. The more prices go up, the more wages go up, and it keeps going and going and going. It feeds into a cycle of inflation. This chart here shows that those who are in the first quartile, the poorest 20% of workers in the United States, actually saw the greatest increase in their wages over any of the other quartiles here. And so the good news is that lower income workers have experienced relatively higher wage increases. But again, price increases have outpaced those wage increases. So the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, the average of those 80,000 goods have increased by 8.6% since the last year, whereas we saw only 6.1% growth in wages. And so people are still paying more out of their pocket than they were, despite the wage increases. Here, I basically drew up what it looks like for the mean household and the lowest 20% of households in terms of their budgets. The main thing I want to illustrate here is on the bottom right-hand side where it says discretionary. So I went ahead and I took out purchases like alcohol and smoking and entertainment and reading. And I said, that's going to be called discretionary. And the lowest 20% have $238 a month in discretionary spending. And you may recall earlier that I said that I did some basic analysis of inflation in the last 2 years that showed that the increase in housing, transportation, and food have gone up together on average by about $235 in the last 2 years. So those low-income families that have $238 in discretionary spending are now spending that on the increased housing, transportation, and food expenses. And if it goes higher, they're going to have to start dipping into some other part of their budget. Will they reduce personal care? Will they reduce health care? Will they reduce apparel? Anything that they have to reduce their spending in is going to be a sacrifice. It's going to result in something negative. And I also just want to point out this one thing here, and the third from the left, personal insurance, where the mean US household contributes $604 per month towards personal insurance and retirement versus only $50.83 for the lowest 20%. And I just want to point out that long-term, having such a small amount of contribution to personal insurance or retirement is going to haunt these low-income families because they don't have that safety net to fall back on when they retire. Low-income families often lack access to affordable financial products as well. So kind of along that same line, they may not be able to afford personal insurance or retirement. They may not actually even be able to afford doing things that could protect them from rising inflation, like putting their money into a CD or a savings bond or an investment. They don't have that discretionary money to do so. A higher percentage of low-income families rent versus owning a home. Like I said at the very beginning, over 50% of the lowest 20% earners in the US rent a home instead of owning. And by renting a home, unfortunately, they're more susceptible to rent increases, whereas home ownership, if you're on a fixed rate mortgage, you're not going to see that increase in as much as you will if you're a renter. And furthermore, because they're not homeowners, they're not building equity. They're not building up their assets or their wealth. And homeownership is a hedge against inflation because the value of homes tends to be fairly strong over time, regardless of inflation. High income families can transition from high quality, expensive goods to low quality ones, whereas low income families don't have that option. They're already likely spending their money on lower quality goods to begin with. And low income families may not be able to take advantage of things like buying things in bulk. They may not be able to afford the $60 Costco membership or Sam's Club membership that would allow them to buy things in bulk and save them money over the long term. Inflation can be felt even more for low-income families because compared to the average of the 80,000 goods, the products in low-income families' budgets have experienced higher inflation. So as we saw, the energy prices was like 34% inflation. We saw that housing was up, rent was up by way more than 8% in the last year. And so the goods that low-income families do consume are inflating by a much higher rate than that average of the consumer price index. I want to just point out as well that at the end of 2021, 78% of adults were reporting doing okay or living comfortably financially. And that was while we were still having some of that stimulus, right? And we were having the child tax credits that helped so many families. And that is the highest percentage of adults that are reporting doing okay since the Fed began the survey in 2013. But I believe because of inflation and because of the end of certain benefits like the child tax credit and the emergency SNAP benefits, that number is going to be falling significantly, that a lot more adults are going to be not doing okay or living comfortably financially. In the yellow here, it's just something from my own bank account that said, as a result of rate increases, because the prime rate increase, it's going to affect things like my Visa credit cards, or if I have a HELOC or other loans tied to the prime rate, people are going to start paying more for borrowing money. So with a lack of savings and an increase in the cost of necessary expenses, and with discretionary spending becoming non-existent, low-income families may become increasingly dependent on some dangerous borrowing, such as overusing their credit cards, taking out payday loans or other debt, and potentially selling or spending down their assets that they may have. If they do have retirement, they may start dipping into that in order to make it by month to month. Increased interest rates are going to also take a bigger hit on low-income families' finances because now they're going to owe more than they would have on that money that they need to borrow. And that's going to make it harder to dig out of debt. And then late payments and overdrawn checking accounts is more likely to happen in the case of low-income families. And that can result in fees. It can spiral out of control. So here are some things that I foresee happening with low-income families and with TRIO students and their families. I think that there's going to be either a reduction of quantity of food that they're purchasing or a reduction in the quality of food that they're purchasing. And both of those are dangerous for their health, right? And we know that students need a healthy diet in order to learn. Higher fuel costs might result in lower attendance at TRIO activities, especially if driving is required. So if your students are required to find transportation to and from tutoring, you might see them reducing their amount of participation at different things depending on how their family's harder hit. Or if they need to pick up a job to help out their family, right? They may be able to come to activities less. These activities that we know will benefit them, but out of necessity, they may have to miss. I also see potentially them reducing in their budget, maybe reducing important safety nets. They may reduce their car insurance. If they reduce their car insurance and they get in an accident, that could be devastating financially. They could completely lose their transportation. They may reduce personal insurance or retirement contributions, which down the line could be very important. They could go without or reduce their important expenditures, like they may delay doing certain medical procedures or buying certain things that they need to replace. They may buy a less expensive car because it's more affordable, but then they may be stuck with maintenance costs or repair costs that are higher because the quality was lower to begin with. Some folks in their families may delay or return from retirement sooner to try and help weather these increasing costs. And then household heating or cooling may become an issue with increased energy costs. If they're behind on payments, their heating might be shut off in the winter. Their electricity or water might be shut off. They may purposely reduce their heating or cooling costs or their electricity costs to try and bring down the expense for their budget. There was a study done in 2003 and published in the American Journal of Public Health that found that a 10-degree Fahrenheit drop in temperature was associated with a $9 per month decrease in expenditures from poor families. In other words, when the temperature decreased, families spent less on groceries so that they could afford to heat their home. There's a potential that some of our TRIO students may be forced to move. They may be forced to move to a lower cost neighborhood. One of my students was telling me that their dad was considering moving to a city 30 minutes away and out of our target area. More students may face homelessness or moving in or doubling up with family or friends, which is a type of homelessness and causes extra stress on that family and on that student when they're sharing a small space with more people. It is harder for people who are under economic discomfort and economic uncertainty to try and make wise and informed economic decisions. It's harder for them to look at the future. It's harder for them to make investments if you're struggling to make it by day to day. And being poor costs much more than having a higher amount of wealth. And here's a couple of examples. So, for example, if you can't pay your electric bill and the power is shut off, you may not have heat or light or electricity, right, for a week or more. And if you have food in the fridge, that food is going to spoil. It costs you more money to replace that. If you can't afford childcare, one parent may have to quit work and stay home, further reducing their income. A single parent might even be forced into public assistance, losing their opportunity to build work experience that could lead to better jobs. And there's many other examples of why being poor actually is more expensive.
This concludes part 4 of this Trio and Inflation webinar. Before I go, I want to plug Trio Works LLC and TrioJoblist.com. Trio Works LLC offers services for Trio staff and students, including professional development, workshops, and camps. TrioJoblist.com is a resource for current and aspiring Trio professionals to share and find careers in Trio programs across the U.S. To learn more, go to trio.works or TrioJoblist.com.